"You'll give me 12 sons," the giant mountain man said to the Chinese woman he bought at auction. The townsfolk whispered about that day for years. He stood 7 feet tall, draped in a buffalo hide, eyes like black coals. She was no taller than his waist, trembling in her silk slippers, chained like a lamb led to slaughter. He didn't smile when he said it. He just lifted her into the saddle like a sack of grain and rode off into the mountains. They said he'd gone mad after the war. They said she'd never survive the winter. But what no one could explain was what happened next. Why did the feared recluse build her a house of cedar? Why did she stay when she could have fled? And what drove a man carved from stone to place wildflowers on her windowsill each morning? This isn't a tale of love. It's a story of redemption, of honor, and the long road to belonging. When a man makes a vow and the mountain keeps its silence, one question lingers. Who truly belonged up there, and who was left behind too soon? Every time I read your comments, I'm reminded that these stories bridge more than just miles. They reach something deeper in all of us. If you still believe in values like honor, redemption, and quiet strength, then you're part of this journey too. Let me know which state you're watching from, and subscribe to help us keep telling stories that matter. "You'll give me 12 sons," the giant mountain man said without turning his head. His voice rumbled low, like thunder across dry earth. The words hung in the cold air, heavy as the snow falling around them. Lian said nothing. She couldn't. Her lips were cracked, her throat dry from fear and wind. She was wrapped in a wool coat too large for her, her tiny hands tucked deep into the sleeves. Her feet dangled uselessly over the side of the mule as it trudged up the winding mountain pass. Bram walked beside her, silent, steady, his massive hand on the reins. Behind them, the trail disappeared beneath the drifting snow. Clearwater Ridge faded into nothing more than smoke and memory. The auction, the staring eyes, the laughter of men who had bet money on her weight and her womb. It was all still burning behind her eyes. She dared not look back. Ahead lay only trees and shadow. And this man, he had not spoken since that one sentence. He hadn't touched her beyond lifting her into the saddle. When the mule paused to rest, he offered her jerky and a tin of water. She took it with trembling fingers. He did not meet her eyes. He simply nodded and turned back to the trail. By dusk, they reached a clearing framed by dark pines and heavy snow-laden branches. The cabin stood alone, squat and square, its cedar walls darkened with age. Smoke trickled from the chimney. Bram opened the door with a creak, stepped aside, and gestured for her to enter. She hesitated, then crossed the threshold. The warmth struck her first, then the scent of firewood, meat, and something old, something sorrowful, like wilted flowers pressed in a book. Inside there was no cage, no chains, only a small table, a stone hearth, and a narrow bed covered in quilts. A bowl of stew sat steaming on the table. Bram pointed to it, then to the bed. He did not smile. He did not speak again. He turned and disappeared into the back room, leaving her alone. Lian stood in the center of the room, her eyes scanning every corner. She touched nothing. Her fingers found the silk pouch around her neck, clutched it tightly. Inside were two things: a wooden carving of a crane and a folded note in Chinese characters she hadn't been able to read since she was taken. Her mother's final words, sewn into cloth, now too faded to decipher. She closed her eyes. She sat slowly, legs trembling, and lifted the spoon. The stew was thick, full of potato and venison. She ate with caution. She didn't know what kindness meant out here, what form danger would take in the wilderness. But she knew how to stay quiet, how to listen. Outside, wind howled like a wounded animal. The logs cracked in the hearth. Bram did not return until the fire had dimmed. He stepped into the room, glanced at the empty bowl, then at the untouched bed. He walked to the hearth, tossed in another log, and without a word lay on the floor in the corner, facing the wall. Lian curled up in the bed, fully clothed, eyes wide open. The cabin did not feel like a prison. Not yet. But she was still a stranger in a strange man's world. A purchased thing. And though he had not laid a hand on her, his words clung to her skin like the snow on her sleeves. 12 sons. Was that a threat? A plan? Or something else altogether? Sleep came in fits. In her dreams, her mother stood in a garden of plum blossoms, holding out a single lantern. Behind her, 12 shadows stood still as trees. Lian reached for the light, but it vanished into smoke. Morning came gray and cold, and still the trail was gone. Snow had buried everything behind her. Only forward remained. The morning light came thin and gray through the frost-glazed window, a pale ribbon of sun catching on the rim of a small wooden bowl set beside her. Steam rose faintly from its surface. Lian pushed herself up slowly, muscles stiff from the cold night. The smell was soft and familiar. Rice boiled with water until it turned to a tender porridge. Congee. Her mother used to make it when she was sick. She wrapped her hands around the bowl and held it there a long time before taking a careful sip. It tasted plain, but warm. A warmth that startled her as much as it soothed her. She glanced toward the door. Bram was nowhere to be seen. Only the dull thud of an axe, distant but steady, broke the silence outside. She rose, her feet brushing against the worn wooden planks. The cabin was plain but tidy, a table with 2 chairs, a shelf lined with jars of dried herbs and beans, a hearth still glowing with the embers of last night's fire. There were no decorations, no personal marks of home, only a sense of order, as if each object had been placed carefully but without joy. A blanket folded square, boots lined up side by side, tools leaned against the wall with soldierly precision. Lian pulled her shawl tighter and wandered to the corner where a broom leaned. She hesitated, then lifted it. The handle was rough but solid. She began to sweep, slow strokes at first, the bristles whispering against the boards. Dust, ash, and bits of pine needles gathered into a neat pile. Her movements grew steadier, and with each stroke something in her chest loosened. It was a small thing, sweeping, tidying, but it gave her back a sliver of control, a thread of dignity to grasp in this strange wilderness. Through the open door she could see Bram, a huge shape splitting logs in clean, brutal arcs. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, his scarred forearms catching the light. He never once looked her way. The axe rose, fell, rose again in a rhythm like a heartbeat. He moved with the silence of a man used to his own company, and for a moment she wondered if he had forgotten she was even there. When he came back inside, he said nothing. He set a bundle of wood beside the hearth, nodded once, and left again. This became the rhythm of their days. She would sweep, scrub, boil water. He would chop, hunt, mend fences. When he needed her to eat, he would point to the table. When she needed to fetch water, he would gesture to the bucket. Not a single word passed between them. Yet she began to study his face in the flicker of firelight at night, how his brow furrowed even in sleep, how his eyes, when they met hers briefly, carried a weight deeper than anger, scarred, weary, watchful, not a predator's eyes, a sentinel's. On the 3rd night, after she had folded her bedding and sat listening to the wind, she heard it, faint at first like the creak of an old beam, then clearer, a low, muffled sound, a man's breath catching. She pressed her ear against the wall between them. The sob was quiet, restrained, as though he were ashamed of it. It did not last long. A shadow passed under the floorboards, a sound like a rat scurrying or a board shifting. She drew her knees to her chest. The next morning the congee waited again. The fire burned low but steady. Bram was outside, splitting more wood. He had left the door open this time, as if inviting the cold or the world in. Lian stood by the hearth, her hands clasped around the silk pouch at her neck. In this cabin of silence, something pressed at the edges of her fear. Not kindness exactly, not yet, but not cruelty either, a space where something unspoken lived. She swept the floor again, slower this time, as though sweeping away not just dust, but the thin line between captivity and survival. Above her, a single beam groaned. Under her feet, the floor whispered with unseen movement. And beyond the window, Bram's axe kept its steady rhythm, each strike echoing through the trees, through her chest, through whatever secret it was he had locked away. The wind in Clearwater Ridge that day carried the stink of sweat, whiskey, and old smoke. The townsfolk gathered at the edge of the market square, drawn like flies to rotting fruit. Lian stood barefoot on a makeshift platform, her wrists bound in rusted iron. A line of women flanked her, faces drawn tight with fear, eyes fixed downward. Their hair had been combed, their cheeks rouged, and their dresses freshly sewn by the same men who would now sell them. Each one had been cleaned and dolled up like cattle before the branding. A miner with soot-streaked hands pointed to a woman 2 spaces down and muttered something about her hips. Laughter followed. A boy not older than 16 stood beside his father, clutching a rifle and watching as if this were a parade. The man next to Lian, pale and thick-necked, barked at her to lift her chin. She didn't. Her eyes stayed low, fixed on a knot in the wooden planks beneath her feet. The man struck her, hard, a sharp backhand that sent her head whipping sideways. A gasp rippled through the crowd, some in mock shock, others in amusement. Lian's lip bled, a thin red line trailing down her chin. She did not cry out. She had already learned that silence was her armor. A gruff voice called the next bid. 200 for the girl with the red sash. Another voice countered, then another. Lian was next. The man behind her yanked her forward by the shoulder. Strong teeth, he announced, forcing her to open her mouth like a mare. Young, no husband, no children. She stood, trembling, her arms aching in their chains. The world swam in her vision. Her father had promised to settle the debt. He had bowed and begged. But the railroad men wanted their silver, and the storekeeper wanted his land. She was payment, nothing more. Then came the silence. Boots struck the wooden planks, heavy, slow, deliberate. The crowd parted without being asked. A shadow moved toward the platform, thick and broad-shouldered, a beast of a man draped in a buffalo hide coat. His beard was coarse, his eyes hidden beneath the brim of a fur-lined hat. He looked like something carved from the cliffs themselves. Bram said nothing. He stepped onto the platform, his size swallowing the space. The man holding Lian stepped back instinctively. You bidding, Bram? Someone jeered. Didn't think you had use for company. More laughter. Bram didn't respond. He reached into his coat, pulled out a leather pouch, and spilled a small fortune in gold coins onto the table. The sound rang out like thunder, final and unquestionable. The auctioneer opened his mouth, then closed it again. Bram moved to Lian. She braced, expecting pain, expecting chains to be yanked. Instead, he reached down and, with surprising care, lifted her wrists. He examined the shackles. Then he took a crowbar from his belt and pried the iron free. It clattered to the ground. She looked up for the first time into his face. His eyes were dark, not with lust, not with rage, but with something colder, heavier. It wasn't pity either. It was duty, etched deep and unforgiving. Without a word, he wrapped a wool cloak around her shoulders, lifted her like a sack of flour, and turned his back on the crowd. No one stopped him. No one dared. The sound of the gold was still ringing. Lian clung to the cloak, heart thundering in her chest. She didn't understand this man. She didn't trust him. But she knew in that moment that she had been bought not for pleasure nor punishment. She had been chosen for something else, Behind them the market resumed, laughter returning like flies to meat, but high above the mountains waited, silent and vast. The wind turned colder, and the man who never smiled carried her toward them, as though he was returning something that had long been lost. The smell of stew filled the cabin before Lian opened her eyes. She rose from the bed cautiously, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. On the table sat a wooden bowl, steam rising in soft curls. Rabbit, from the scent, wild, gamey, and seasoned with pine needles and salt. A slab of cornbread rested beside it, its edges browned. No sound from the other room, no boots, no breath. Bram was gone. She approached the table slowly. Her stomach ached with hunger, but she paused as she always did, waiting for the strike that never came. None did. She ate carefully, chewing slowly, her hands trembling around the spoon. The fire was low. She added 2 logs, then took the broom and swept the floor again, not because it needed it, but because the rhythm helped keep the fear away. Her eyes fell on a shirt hanging from a nail near the door, a large worn work shirt, its shoulder torn, the stitching frayed. She took it down gently, examining the rip. The cloth was stiff with dried sap and the faint scent of sweat and cedar. In the chest beneath the window, she found cloth scraps and an old sewing needle. She sat on the edge of the bed, folding the fabric across her knees and began to stitch. Her fingers moved with quiet focus, the way her mother had taught her before the debts, before the railroads, before the silence. Each stitch was small, precise. The rip vanished beneath her work, leaving only a faint line, like a healed scar. She folded the shirt neatly and left it where it had hung. Hours passed. The shadows in the cabin stretched long, then shrank back again. When Bram returned, dusk had swallowed the sky. Snow clung to his boots, and he carried a brace of grouse slung over his shoulder. He entered wordlessly, set the birds on the counter, then turned toward the nail where his shirt had been. He paused. His hand touched the cloth. Slowly he lifted it, ran his thumb along the seam she had mended. His face didn't change, but his shoulders eased just slightly. He folded the shirt carefully, deliberately, and set it back on the nail. Then without a word he walked to the hearth, rummaged through a small chest, and pulled out a book. It was thin, worn, the cover peeling. He held it out to her. Lian took it with hesitant hands. It was a Chinese-English dictionary, a well-used one, with corners curled and a spine mended in wax thread. She opened it. On one page, a word had been marked in pencil, circled over and over in slow, dark loops. Safe. She looked up at him. He didn't meet her eyes. He merely nodded once, then turned away to pluck the birds. That night she lit a stub of candle and sat by the window. The book rested on her knees. Her finger traced the word again and again, feeling the grooves where the pencil had pressed. Safe. Not free, not home, but safe. She said it softly, unsure if it belonged to her yet. The candle flickered. Outside, snow fell in soft spirals. The mountains made no sound. Inside, the silence breathed differently now, not empty, but waiting. The kind of quiet that lets seeds root in the dark. The bell above the general store door jingled with a kind of lazy clang that meant snow was falling again. Inside, the stove crackled, casting a red glow over rows of sacks and canned peaches. Miss Harlan stood by the counter with a jar of pickled beets in her gloved hand, her lips pursed so tight they looked stitched shut. She leaned closer to Mr. Hensley, the storekeeper, lowering her voice as if the beets themselves might gossip. "She won't last a month up there," she said with grim certainty. "Tiny thing like that. Looks like a porcelain doll someone left in the snow. And him? He's got no right. Bought her like a man buys a mule." Mr. Hensley grunted. "Bram ain't right, never was. Killed a man with a sledgehammer. They say Didn't blink after. Just walked off into the hills like death was a chore he'd finished. Two miners standing near the back of the store chuckled darkly. One spat into the pot-bellied stove, where it hissed. Maybe he bought her for firewood or breeding. Man like that don't pay in gold just to talk. Miss Harlan narrowed her eyes. She's Chinese. They see their women different. Servants or wives or... She stopped, blinking at her own words. Whatever she is, that cabin's no place for a girl. No woman's been up there since his wife and daughter died. That mountain's cursed. Across town, smoke curled from the chimney of the tiny chapel. Inside, the benches were cold, the air scented with ash and hymnals. Wiaka, the tribal elder, sat in the last pew, his thick fingers threading beads through a worn leather string. A young boy from the reservation stood beside him, whispering. They say he bought a girl, the boy said. They say she's his now. Wiaka didn't answer at first. He tied a knot in the leather, eyes on the altar. The mountain doesn't choose lightly, he said at last. That man lost everything he had and became a shadow. Most folk go mad when their grief turns in on itself. But Bram, he folded into the land. He disappeared into it. The boy frowned. Is she safe? No, Wiaka said. But neither is he. That kind of sorrow. He held up the string of beads, each one carved with symbols. It sinks into your bones. It either kills you or changes what you carry. The rumors spread through Clearwater Ridge like smoke on a dry wind. The blacksmith said Bram was building something, maybe a cradle. The school teacher claimed she saw a figure, small and cloaked, drawing water from the creek, said she looked too calm for a captive. The saloon girls laughed and said Bram probably didn't even know what to do with a woman anymore. But they all agreed on one thing. The girl had been bought, a transaction made in plain sight. No papers, no protection, no preacher's blessing, just gold on a table and silence from a man too big to question. Some saw it as sin, a grotesque arrangement that should be undone by law or by fire. Others saw tragedy, the kind that belongs to the land and has no fixing. A few, very few, wondered if something else was unfolding. Something old, like a story too slow for newspapers. At night, the town windows glowed with lamplight and speculation, but the mountain stood still, indifferent and unmoved, keeping its secrets under a blanket of snow. And in that high silence, neither law nor gossip could reach. Only time, only truth. The wind pressed against the cabin walls like a hand trying to get in. Lian moved quietly through the room, brushing dust from the windowsill, straightening the quilt on the bed. The days had settled into a rhythm now, slow and watchful. Bram came and went without speaking. He left food. She kept the cabin in order. But something remained locked between them, like a door with no key. That afternoon, while sweeping near the hearth, her broom caught on a loose board. It lifted slightly at one corner. Curious, she set the broom aside and knelt, running her fingers along the edges until it gave with a quiet creak. Beneath the floorboard, nestled in a pocket of dry earth, was a rusted tin box. She hesitated before lifting it out. The metal was cold, pitted with age. The latch creaked as she opened it. Inside lay a small stack of items, each worn with handling and time. A faded photograph, its corners curled, showed a woman with high cheekbones and dark eyes, her hair pinned neatly back. Beside her stood a little girl, no more than 5, with a wide grin and braids down her back. They were standing in front of this very cabin, though the door looked newer then, freshly painted. Beneath the photo was a ring, simple, gold, and thin with wear. Lian turned it over in her palm, feeling the cold bite of it. Underneath, folded carefully, was a letter. The ink had blurred with moisture long ago, but the strokes were still faintly visible. English cursive she couldn't read. She traced one line, trying to guess its meaning. A name, maybe, a goodbye, a promise. She sat there for a long while, the box open in her lap. The photograph stared up at her, too quiet. She closed the tin and slid it back into its hiding place, replacing the board and sweeping the dust over it as if nothing had changed. But something had. That evening, after the stew was eaten and the fire was low, she brewed a pot of tea using dried herbs she'd found on the shelf. She poured it into the tin cup and approached him where he sat by the fire, his great hands still. She offered it wordlessly, palms open. Bram looked at the cup as if it were something alive. For a long moment he didn't move. Then slowly he reached out and took it. He held it in both hands, staring into the steam. When he finally drank, it was a slow, deliberate sip. A tear slid down his cheek. Just one. He didn't wipe it away. Lian sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap. The silence between them shifted. Not gone, but no longer empty. Something had passed through it, like a bird's shadow crossing snow. The next morning she found a pair of leather gloves and fur-lined boots at the foot of her bed. They were old but cared for, stitched strong, shaped small to fit her feet. Beside them lay a folded piece of paper, blank, except for one word scrawled in careful print. Lian. Her name, written by his hand. She held it close to her chest and looked toward the door, where the wind no longer sounded so lonely. The morning was crisp, the kind that made breath puff out in clouds and turn the creek's surface into a mirror of thin, shifting ice. Lian carried the empty water pail with careful steps. The boots Bram had given her crunching softly over the frozen grass. The woods were still in that hushed way they often were before noon, as if the trees were listening. She had come to know the trail to the creek, the twist between two leaning pines, the patch of lichen on the fallen log, the bend where the ground sloped toward the water. She moved with confidence now, her hands steady, her eyes watching the ground. The sun broke through the trees in slanted rays, glinting off frost-covered leaves. She knelt at the edge of the creek, dipped the pail, and let the water rush in with a gentle slosh. Then a snap, a crunch of movement. She turned. Just yards away, a small bear cub stood on its hind legs, pawing curiously at a clump of weeds. Its eyes met hers, round, wide, and far too close. Lian froze, her breath caught mid-inhale. The cub huffed, dropped to all fours, and ambled toward her with the careless interest of a child. She backed away, the pail slipping from her hand. Water splashed onto the ground, the cold soaking her boots. And then she heard it, a deep, guttural roar that seemed to split the trees open. From the underbrush, the mother bear charged, massive, black-furred, a wall of muscle and fury barreling toward her with terrifying speed. Lian stumbled, scrambling backward, slipping on wet leaves. Her scream died in her throat. Her legs wouldn't move fast enough. Her hands clawed at the earth. The bear was only yards away, mouth open, teeth bared. Then gunfire. A single deafening crack echoed through the clearing. The bear skidded to a halt. Bram stood between them, massive and unmoving, his shotgun raised to the sky. The second shot never came. His stance was wide, arms out, shielding Lian completely. He didn't flinch, didn't speak, just stared at the mother bear, eyes steady, breath slow. The bear huffed again, ears twitching, then turned. She disappeared into the trees with her cub, the brush rustling behind her like a river of fur and shadow. Silence fell. Lian pressed her hands to her chest, heart pounding, so loud it hurt. Bram turned to her, his face tight, jaw clenched. A long scratch bled slowly down his forearm, torn open by a branch or maybe the bear's paw. He offered no words, only helped her to her feet. They walked back to the cabin in silence, his large hand steadying her elbow whenever she faltered. Inside, she led him to the chair by the hearth, fetched a clean cloth and the small jar of salve she'd made from bear fat and spruce resin. She cleaned the wound carefully, her hands shaking only slightly. He watched her, quiet and still. When she finished, she didn't step back. She looked up into his face, her voice rising from somewhere deep, somewhere long buried. "Why save me?" she asked, barely more than a whisper. Bram's eyes darkened, not with anger, but with something older. His lips parted, the words gravel in his throat. "Because I didn't last time." He stood and walked away before she could answer, the floorboards creaking under his boots. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like breath returning to lungs that had been still too long. And inside, beside the hearth, Lian sat holding the bloodied cloth, her mind turning over his words like stones in a stream. The fire cracked low in the hearth, and Bram sat alone at the edge of his bedroll, staring at the floor like it might speak back. The night outside was still, the kind of still that only deep winter brings, when the snow muffles sound and the trees hold their breath. Lian slept in the other room, her breath soft and even, a reminder that the cabin now held more than ghosts. But for Bram, ghosts never left. They clung to the corners, to the beams, to the faint scent of rice and wild herbs still lingering in the kitchen shelves. He closed his eyes and the past surged forward. Once he had worn blue, a soldier in the Union Army, tall and broad, quick with an axe and quicker with a temper. The war had hollowed him in places he never knew existed, but peace had come, and with it, love in the form of a woman named Lin, a Chinese herbalist with laughter like wind chimes and hands that healed bruises with the same care she used to steep tea. She'd opened a small apothecary in a frontier town where suspicion brewed like bad liquor. Folks called her the foreigner woman, some with curiosity, others with spite. Still, Bram built her a home. They planted beans, raised chickens, carved out a life from wood and sweat. Lin bore him a daughter, May, bright-eyed and curious, who chased butterflies through the fields and clung to his beard with sticky fingers. He taught her how to fish. She taught him how to smile. Then came the whispers. A railroad camp just over the ridge was robbed. Men went missing. A map was found in Chinese script. Someone said Lin had drawn it. Someone said she passed secrets in tinctures. The talk thickened until it burst open in fire and screams. Bram had been away, hunting. He returned to ash and silence. The cabin was gone. Lin's mortar lay cracked beside the hearthstone. May's doll, one he carved from pine, was crushed beneath a boot print. There were no bodies, only what the fire hadn't taken. A neighbor later told him a vigilante group had come in the night, said they were keeping the country safe. Bram buried what was left. Then he vanished. He climbed into the mountains like a wounded animal, away from roads, men, questions. For years he lived with no name, hunting only what he needed, speaking to no one. The world forgot him, and he was glad of it. But the grief didn't fade. It hardened. So when he saw the girl, Lian, on that auction block, chained and silent, wearing the same expression Lin once had when she stood among strangers, he felt the cold come back. Not rage, not pity, duty. He hadn't saved them. But maybe he could protect this one. In the days since, he'd watched Lian move through his home with quiet strength, tending the hearth, mending what was broken. She didn't flinch when he entered the room. She didn't weep when the nights grew long. She carried herself with the same steel his wife had once shown. She reminded him of May, of the girl his daughter never got the chance to become. He opened the tin box late that night, ran his fingers over the photograph. Lin and May forever caught in a moment of sunlight. He closed it gently, as if afraid to wake them. In the silence that followed, he whispered to the dark, "I will not fail again." And though no one heard it, The mountains perhaps did. The snow melted in slow sighs, revealing the earth beneath like old skin peeling away. The mountains exhaled the last breath of winter, and spring crept into the valley, soft, green, and full of secrets. Lian stood at the edge of the clearing with her sleeves rolled up and her palms pressed into the thawing soil. The ground was still cold but not unkind. She knelt there, digging rows with her fingers, marking lines with a stick. Beans, turnips, and whatever wild herbs she could gather from the forest edge would go here. It wasn't much, but it was hers. Bram brought her a wooden crate filled with sprouting starters. He said nothing, just set them down and stood beside her for a moment, watching. Then he picked up a spade and began turning the earth on the other side of the clearing. They didn't speak, but their silence had changed. It wasn't empty now. It was full of rhythm, the scrape of metal against soil, the call of a hawk overhead, the slow rise of trust taking root. Each morning she worked the rows. Bram would tend the fencing or chop wood, his shadow always within reach. At midday they ate together, sometimes stew, sometimes salted fish on old bread. Lian taught herself the names of the birds that came to the garden edge. She sketched them on bits of scrap paper Bram had dug out from a chest in the back room. When the wind was gentle, she sat outside and traced the clouds with charcoal, her drawings soft and curved, like memory made visible. One day while Bram was away hunting, she opened the door to find a new desk by the window. Rough-hewn, but sturdy. The legs were carved with simple care, and the top was sanded smooth. A place to sit, to draw, to write, if she ever found the words. She touched its surface gently, whispering thanks to no one. That night, as the fire crackled low, Lian brought out a reed flute she had whittled from river cane. She turned it over in her hands, then brought it to her lips and played a simple tune, a lullaby she remembered from long ago. The melody slipped through the cracks of the cabin like warm light, curling into the corners, wrapping around the silence. Bram stood outside, leaning against the doorframe, listening. He didn't move, didn't speak. His eyes were fixed on the stars, but his breath slowed, and something behind his chest, something locked away, shifted. The notes of the flute carried the scent of turned earth and growing things. It reminded him of a time before war, before ash, before silence. Lian played until her fingers ached, then set the flute down. She didn't know he'd heard her. She only knew that something inside her felt less hollow. The garden began to sprout within the week. Tiny green leaves pushed through the dirt, trembling but alive. Birds nested in the eaves of the cabin. The air no longer smelled of smoke and cold, but of pine sap and damp soil. They still did not speak much, but when Bram passed her a tin cup of tea or when she left a freshly mended glove by his tools, their eyes met. And for a moment, it felt like the worst had passed. In the garden's first blooms, in the quiet music, in the slant of sun through the window, hope had begun to grow, uneven, uncertain, but stubborn as spring. The sun had risen sharp and bright that morning, the way it sometimes did in spring before the rain returned. Lian was bent over the garden rows, gently clearing weeds from the bean sprouts. The earth smelled of life, rich, black, forgiving. She didn't hear the horses at first, only the sudden silence of birds, the kind of hush that rolls in just before something breaks. 3 riders appeared from the trees, clean boots, city coats, polished pistols slung low on their hips. They weren't hunters or townsfolk. These men smelled of money and maps. Behind them came a wagon, wheels rattling over stone, carrying ledgers, crates, and a man with a cigar clenched between yellow teeth. Bram stepped out from the side of the cabin, axe in hand. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. "Well, I'll be damned," the man with the cigar said, dismounting with a practiced grunt. "Didn't think the mountain had company." And a woman, no less. Pretty thing, too. Got a name, sweetheart? His eyes raked over Lian like she was inventory. She stood slowly, wiping dirt from her hands, spine straight. Bram moved beside her, the axe still in his grip, his silence like a held breath. The man spat the cigar stub into the dirt and grinned. Name's Harrow. Railroad land procurement. This whole ridge is prime. We'll be laying tracks come summer. Need to know who owns what and what it'll cost to move it. He reached into his coat and pulled a folded map. This here parcel, it's on our line. Belongs to no one on record. Squatter land. But I'm a fair man. I make offers. He looked at Lian again. Hell, I'll even buy her proper this time. Save you the trouble, old man. Can't be easy keeping one like her out here. Bram's body moved before his face did. In one motion, the axe flew from his hand and buried itself in the post beside Harrow's head. The man flinched, genuinely startled now. His men drew their pistols halfway, but Bram was already between them, fists clenched, shoulders coiled like a loaded spring. Lian stepped forward, breath shallow, legs trembling. She placed both hands on Bram's chest and stood between him and the railroad men. Her voice was soft, barely more than wind through leaves. Booyah, Lucia, she whispered, not with blood. Bram's eyes met hers. Something inside them shifted. Slowly, his fists loosened. He took a step back. Harrow exhaled and straightened his coat with shaking fingers. You're lucky she's got a softer head than you, he muttered, nodding toward his men. Let's go. We'll be back. With paper, with law, with men who don't flinch. He mounted his horse and turned back once before disappearing into the trees. You can't hide up here forever. Progress don't wait. When they were gone, Lian let herself breathe again. Bram retrieved the axe from the post, his hands tight around the handle. He looked at her, not with anger, but something harder to name. Respect, perhaps. Guilt. A vow renewed. That night, the wind howled again, but it wasn't from the mountain. It came from a world that wanted to carve lines through land and people alike, that didn't care who bled for its tracks. And still, the fire inside the cabin burned steady, two shadows beside it, bracing for what would come. Miss Harlan's boots sank deep into the muddy trail, but she pressed on, her shawl drawn tight over her shoulders and a tin of fresh cornbread cradled in her arms. The mountain path was steeper than she remembered, narrower too. It twisted like a serpent through groves of pine and thickets of saplings, each turn drawing her farther from town and deeper into the wild hush of Bram Dawson's land. She had told herself she came for righteousness, for justice, for the sake of a girl she'd never spoken to. At the edge of the tree line, the cabin emerged, weathered, square, unchanging. Smoke curled gently from the chimney. The garden in front had grown thick with green, rows of beans winding up slender sticks, flowers blooming in mismatched clusters. A pair of birds perched on the windowsill. It was not the den of sin she had pictured. Still, she tightened her jaw and marched forward. Lian was on the porch, broom in hand, sweeping pine needles with slow, careful strokes. She wore a linen apron, smudged with soil, and her hair was pinned back in a braid. On a small wooden stool beside her sat an open book, the old dictionary Bram had given her. She was sounding out a word in English, her voice soft, clear. C-O-M-P-A, compassion. Miss Harlan stopped at the base of the porch steps. Lian looked up and smiled, not with fear, not with apology, but with the calm assurance of someone who knew where she stood. Ma'am, Lian said politely. Miss Harlan blinked. I came to check on your welfare, she said stiffly. There's been talk in town. Folks believe you may be here against your will. Lian nodded once, her smile never fading. Would you like tea? I didn't come for tea. But you carried bread, Lian said gently, gesturing toward the tin in Miss Harlan's arms. That means you care. The older woman flushed and stepped onto the porch, glancing warily at the door. "Is he here? The man?" "He's in the woods hunting," Lian replied. "He'll be back by nightfall." They sat across from each other at the small table just inside the cabin, the sunlight pouring in through the open door. Lian poured tea from a ceramic pot, steam curling upward between them. Miss Harlan studied the walls. Everything was tidy. Shelves were lined with jars. Bundles of herbs hung from hooks. A sketch of a blue jay was pinned beside the hearth. The girl's touch was everywhere. Not the trace of a prisoner, but a homemaker. "You know he bought you," Miss Harlan said finally, her voice cracking like a twig. "Yes," Lian said without hesitation. "And yet you stay." "I am not a prisoner," she said, then added quietly, "Not anymore." There was no bitterness in her tone, just truth. Miss Harlan left before Bram returned. She descended the mountain slower than she had climbed it, the bread tin empty in her pack, her thoughts heavy. That night back in town, she knelt at her bedside, the oil lamp flickering. Her prayers came slower than usual. She had always been so certain, so ready to label good and evil, sinner and saint. But now when she closed her eyes, she didn't see chains or shame. She saw a girl sweeping her porch, reading aloud and offering tea, and she saw dignity where she'd expected despair. The bell over Clearwater Ridge's chapel door rang out Sunday morning as Miss Harlan stepped inside with her hands folded neatly in front of her. The usual whisper of gossip followed her, but this time she didn't shush it. Instead, when the preacher called for testimonies, she stood from her pew and cleared her throat. "I went up that mountain," she said. "I saw her with my own eyes. Not a slave, not a prisoner." She swept her porch, brewed her tea, and spoke her words slow and honest. "That girl, Lian, isn't what we've been saying she is." A silence fell over the chapel. The preacher looked at her with narrowed eyes, but he nodded slowly. Wiaka, seated at the back with his hands folded over his cane, gave a single approving nod. It started small. The blacksmith, Elmer Cobb, sent up a bundle of tools wrapped in canvas with one of his sons. "Spare hammer, good nails. Everyone needs a latch that holds," he'd said. The preacher himself rode up 2 days later with a copy of the good book and a formal invitation to Sunday service. Bram didn't speak a word when he arrived, but Lian thanked him with a bow and accepted the Bible with both hands. Then came the children. One afternoon, just as Lian was tending to the sprouts in the garden, a little girl with a missing front tooth appeared at the edge of the trees. She held a small bundle of wildflowers, stems crushed in her fist. She didn't speak, just held them out like an offering. Lian knelt, took them gently, and smiled. The girl fled a heartbeat later, disappearing into the trees. But the next day, another child came. Then two, then more. It wasn't a flood of kindness, but a trickle, one that built quietly with the days. The townsfolk started to talk differently. The saloon girls said maybe the big man wasn't a monster after all. The school teacher mentioned the sketches Lian had sent down the hill with the preacher. A bird in flight, a sprouting seed, a hand holding another. "She's got real talent," she said. "You can see the soul in her lines." But good things in Clearwater never lasted long without being challenged. Harrow came back. He arrived in a cloud of dust, his horse foaming at the bit, a rolled map in one hand, and a sheriff's badge pinned crooked on his chest. Behind him rode 2 deputies and a man in a gray suit with a briefcase. He stopped in the middle of the town square, tossed the map onto the preacher's stoop, and bellowed loud enough to rattle the windows. "This land ain't his," he shouted, pointing toward the mountains, "and she ain't his either." People gathered slowly, drawn by the heat in his voice. Harrow unrolled the map with a theatrical flourish. "No deed, no claim, no marriage, no law." Miss Harlan stepped forward. "And yet no crime," he sneered. "We'll see what the judge says when he gets here. I got documents coming up from Helena. I'll have that land and that girl within the week." But this time no one clapped. No one laughed. The blacksmith folded his arms. The preacher stepped down from the chapel steps and stood beside Miss Harlan. Wiyaka watched from the edge, quiet but alert. Harrow saw it. The shift. The air was different now. The ground beneath him less sure. He spat in the dirt and climbed back on his horse. "You've all gone soft," he growled, "but law don't bend for sympathy." As he rode out, the people of Clearwater didn't chase him off, but they didn't cheer him either. That night, lanterns burned a little longer. Doors stayed open just a little later. And in the hush between voices, the town began to understand something they hadn't before. They had once seen a scandal. Now they were beginning to see a story. The fire came just before dawn. Lian was the first to smell the smoke. Thick, bitter, and wrong. It curled through the cracks of the cabin like a warning, pulling her from sleep with a start. She rushed to the window. Flames licked the edge of the lower barn, the one Bram had built for tools, feed, and the animals they had begun to raise. A lamb's bleat cut through the air, shrill, panicked. She ran without shoes, without coat, her braid flying behind her like a loose thread. The barn door groaned under her hand as she forced it open. The fire had started in the rear, already devouring the beams. Heat slammed against her skin. She saw the lamb, small and wild-eyed, cornered near the pen gate. She lunged through the smoke, coughing, eyes watering. The world turned orange, then black. When Bram reached her, the fire had begun to climb toward the roof. He saw the open door, the small footprints in the mud, and he didn't stop to think. He plunged in, pulling his scarf over his mouth. The smoke was a wall, thick enough to choke a bear. He found her curled around the lamb, coughing weakly, her hands wrapped around its tiny body. He didn't speak. He just lifted them both, one in each arm, and barreled back through the flames. Outside, he collapsed on his knees, laying her down in the dirt. Her face was streaked with soot, hair stuck to her cheek. She was breathing, but barely. She opened her eyes and whispered, "Saved it." Bram touched her forehead gently, then stood, face blackened, rage boiling in his chest like a kettle left too long on the fire. He went inside, wiped the ash from his eyes, and opened the small safe beneath the floorboards. Inside was a bundle of papers, one in particular, carefully folded, its ink faded but legible. He tucked it under his coat and mounted his horse, leaving a trail of soot behind him as he thundered down the mountain path. By the time he reached Clearwater's town square, people were already gathering. Word of the fire had moved faster than horses. Harrow stood smug near the well, a fresh cigar clamped between his teeth, flanked by two hired men. Bram dismounted, walked straight into the circle of watching eyes, and threw the scorched deed at Harrow's feet. The paper landed with a flutter, its edges singed, the signature still visible in delicate ink. Lin Mei Hua, Lin Mei Hua, Bram's wife. "She bought this land before she died," Bram said, his voice low and hoarse from smoke. "It's hers. Still is." The crowd leaned in. Murmurs rippled through them. Harrow kicked the deed aside with his boot. "That ain't legal. A woman can't own land outright, not in her name, and not one that don't speak English." Bram stepped forward. "She did speak English. She spoke 6 languages, and I'll bury you where you stand if you say her name with that mouth." The tension snapped taut. Harrow's hand hovered near his pistol. Then came the voice that cut through it all. "That will be enough." The judge had arrived, his long coat dusted from the trail, a leather satchel in his hand. He stepped into the circle with the authority of a man used to deciding fates. "Show me that deed," he said. Bram handed it over, jaw tight. The judge unfolded it, scanned the ink, then looked up at Harrow, unimpressed. "Let's settle this proper," he said. "No fire, no fists, just truth." And for the first time, the crowd didn't look to Harrow for answers. They looked to Bram, and Bram stood taller than the courthouse steeple. The courthouse in Clearwater Ridge hadn't seen a crowd like this since the railroad surveyors came through 5 years prior. Townsfolk lined the benches, leaned against the walls, stood shoulder to shoulder at the windows. The air was thick with tobacco smoke, nervous breath, and a tension that buzzed low like bees beneath floorboards. Judge Ainsley entered through the side door with the slow, deliberate gait of a man who had once marched through cannon fire. His right leg dragged slightly, a souvenir from Gettysburg. He wore no robe, just a worn black coat and a deep scar across his cheek that whispered of bayonets. When he sat behind the desk, the room fell quiet. Bram stood near the front, his coat still dusted with ash, hands clasped behind his back like a soldier awaiting orders. Beside him, Lian sat with her hair freshly brushed, a shawl draped over her shoulders. Her face was pale, but her eyes, those eyes held steady. On the table before the judge lay the documents, the burned deed bearing Lin Meihua's signature, the old marriage license, and a folded letter written in both English and Chinese, found in the tin beneath Bram's floorboards. A letter from Lin to the county registrar, requesting the land title be filed in her name for protection while Bram served his last months in uniform. It had never been answered, but it had been written. Judge Ainsley read through each page slowly, eyes narrowing only once. When he came to the signature in delicate brushstroke, he set the papers down and removed his spectacles. "Mr. Dawson," he said, voice grave but clear, "your wife was the legal owner of this property under the Joint Homestead Act filed at the time. Though the court failed to finalize it in record, the intention is evident, and the testimony from Miss Harlan and Elder Wiaka confirms it was commonly known." He turned toward Lian. "And as for this woman, Miss Lian, she is no fugitive. She was not stolen. She has broken no law. She was purchased in an unlawful act and brought here. Yes, but what has occurred since was not bondage. It was survival. It was something else." A murmur passed through the room. Harrow, red-faced and scowling, stepped forward. "You can't be serious, Judge. She don't belong here. She don't belong to him. This whole thing is a—" "You will sit down," Judge Ainsley said, his voice suddenly sharp enough to cut iron. "You brought fire onto a man's home. You threatened a girl with your words. You disgraced the law with your greed. You have 2 days to leave this county, and you will not return." Harrow opened his mouth again, then saw the faces around him, stern, cold, unmoved. He turned and stormed out without another word. The silence lingered for a beat, then it broke, not in gasps or shouts, but in applause. It started at the back, one set of hands, then another. Then the blacksmith stood and clapped. The preacher joined. Miss Harlan wept into her gloves as she clapped. The room echoed with the sound, not of triumph, but of rightness, a sound rarely heard in rooms like this. Bram turned to Lian. For the first time, he truly looked at her, not as an echo of what he lost, not as something fragile or owed, but as herself. She met his gaze, not with fear or sorrow, but with quiet strength. And in that look, something shifted. A new story began, not as protector and protected, not as debt and redemption, but as 2 lives walking forward side by side. The meadow bloomed in bursts of gold and violet, wildflowers swaying like dancers in the morning breeze. Where the barn once stood, Bram now worked with steady hands and slow purpose, shaping timber into walls, laying floorboards, measuring windows to face the rising sun. The new room would be hers. He said it plain, without pride or hesitation. It ought to face the light. Lian watched from the edge of the garden, her sleeves rolled up and a small trowel in her hand. She didn't ask why. She understood. It wasn't repayment. It wasn't duty. It was a gesture, an offering. He built not to replace what was lost, but to honor what had been found. Inside the cabin, changes bloomed too. They no longer ate in silence. Sometimes he asked her about the names of herbs or where she had learned to make dumplings from flour and bone broth. Other times she'd ask what words meant in English, and he'd try to answer, drawing in the ash of the hearth if he needed to. He mispronounced more than he got right, but he tried. Ping an, he repeated one evening, the phrase for peace fumbling over the tones. She laughed softly, corrected him, then said it again until it settled on his tongue. In return, Bram taught her to ride. The mare was patient and old, a creature with more miles behind her than ahead, but kind. At first, Lian clung to the saddle like it might throw her. Bram walked beside her every time. By the second week, she was riding alone, hair loose in the wind, skirt fluttering. She returned each afternoon with sun on her face and stories of a fox she'd spotted, or the way the trail curved past the creek in a way she hadn't noticed before. Then came the night when the sky was clear and full of stars. They sat outside, a kettle of tea between them, the air cool with the promise of summer. Fireflies blinked along the meadow. And the silence between them was no longer the silence of strangers. It was the quiet of something taking root. Bram cleared his throat. "I've been meaning to ask you something," he said, eyes fixed on the horizon. "You don't owe me nothing. I know that. And I know the way we started ain't right. But this place, it's better with you in it. So I'm asking, not saying, would you stay? Not for sons, not for chores, but for something real, something of your own." Lian didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached beneath her shawl and drew out the silk pouch she had never once taken off. She placed it in his calloused hand, and he opened it gently. Inside was a tiny wooden carving, no larger than a button. A crane, wings tucked, carved in soft strokes. Time had worn it smooth. She looked at it, then at him. "My father gave it to me," she said. "Before the auction, he said, 'This is your name in wood.' I held it when I couldn't speak, when I forgot who I was." She paused. "I think it's time I carve something else. For myself. For here." Bram closed his fingers around the carving and gave a quiet nod. And as the night deepened, the house behind them no longer felt like a shelter for two broken souls. It felt like the beginning of a home. The snow came again, soft and slow, like it had learned to ask permission before covering the earth. It gathered on rooftops and nestled in the branches. But this year, the silence it brought was different. Not hollow, not heavy. It wrapped the cabin in stillness. Yes, but not the kind that suffocates. This was the kind that let things breathe. 1 year had passed since the fire, since the judgment in the square, since the town turned its eyes and finally saw not a scandal, but a life. Lian stood in the new room Bram had built, the morning light spilling through the window, her breath fogging the glass. She watched as 3 children trudged up the path toward the cabin, bundled in scarves, faces red with cold. She opened the door before they could knock. They came every Thursday, 2 from the ridge, 1 from the reservation, hands ink-stained, eyes curious. She taught them how to draw what they saw, and more importantly, what they felt. A tree not just with branches, but with memory. A bird not just in flight, but escaping something. The children didn't always understand the words, but their pencils moved with purpose. Bram had started on the schoolhouse in the spring. Not alone. Clearwater Ridge had changed since the trial. The blacksmith gave nails. The preacher offered benches from the old chapel, and Miss Harlan sent up baskets of dried fruit and blankets sewn with her initials. Even Harrow's name had vanished from lips like a curse finally lifted. Bram never asked the town for help, but he never refused it either. He worked in quiet rhythm, his hands strong, his shoulders still scarred. But when he lifted beams into place and hammered them firm, there was a peace in his movement, a steadiness that hadn't been there before. The man who once lived in silence now spoke in small, solid acts. By late summer, the schoolhouse stood, modest, square, full of light. A bell hung above the door, its rope coiled neatly inside. Lian hung her sketches on the walls, each one a soft testament to the lives now being shaped in its shelter. At night, when the fire crackled and the wind whispered against the shutters, Bram and Lian sat side by side. Sometimes they spoke about the weather, the children, the stubborn mule that refused to wear a saddle. Sometimes they said nothing at all, but in that quiet, nothing felt missing. Words had become a choice, not a necessity. Bram carved a new chair for Lian's desk. She painted the trim of the cabin with berry dye. They planted bulbs in the cold soil, trusting them to rise come spring. The world hadn't changed fast, but it had changed honestly. And as the snow deepened and the sky turned silver, the cabin on the mountain no longer seemed far from the world. It had become a part of it, a place stitched back together, not with law, not with gold, but with trust, with labor, and with faith. In the hush of winter, peace had come, not granted, not seized, chosen. The thaw came early that year. By the second week of March, the last ice melted from the eaves of the cabin, dripping in gentle rhythm onto softening earth. The garden yawned awake, its beds dark with moisture, its edges sprouting early green. Birds returned, and with them, the sound of life stirring once more. Lian stood in the meadow beyond the cabin, a linen apron tied around her waist, a small pouch of seeds in her hand. The soil was ready, tilled, warm to the touch, humming with quiet promise. Bram watched her from the porch, arms crossed, the sun resting on his shoulders like an old friend. She knelt carefully, pressing her hands into the ground, her fingers parting the earth in small, even spaces. One by one, she planted 12 sunflower seeds in a curved line that faced the rising sun. She didn't speak as she worked, but when she stood, brushing her hands clean, she looked at him and smiled. "You said I'd give you 12 sons," she said, voice light, not unkind. "But I think these are what I'll choose to raise." Bram blinked, startled. Then a sound broke from him, a low, surprised laugh, rough at the edges, but unmistakably real. The kind of laugh that hadn't escaped his chest in years. It rose into the clear mountain air, like a bird set loose from a long-shut cage. Lian's smile widened. That afternoon, children from town came up the trail, as they often did now. Their boots kicked up dust, their voices carried on the wind. One carried a slate board, another a bundle of wildflowers. They ran to Lian with stories of a new calf born at the blacksmith's farm, of a bird's nest found near the schoolhouse bell. She listened, kneeling so they could speak into her ear, and then led them to the back of the cabin where sketchbooks and chalk waited beneath the awning. Bram watched them from a distance, his heart swelling with something he once thought had died. The mountain that had once broken him now stood behind them like a guardian, no longer a place of hiding, but of growth. The meadow soon filled with motion, chalk drawings, small voices, the occasional burst of laughter. The sunflowers had not yet bloomed, but their place was marked. Lian watered the soil around them each day, whispering to each seed as if it could hear her. "This one is for kindness. This one for strength. This one for the ones we've lost." The ghosts still lingered in the corners of Bram's memory, but they no longer haunted. They watched perhaps, but with peace. His wife's laughter, his daughter's tiny hand, the firelight of old regrets. They had softened. In their place stood this, a woman planting what she chose, children learning what they dreamed, and a man no longer carrying the weight of everything alone. At dusk, the breeze carried the scent of damp earth and pine. Lian stood beside Bram, their shoulders nearly touching, watching the last of the children head down the trail, their silhouettes small against the amber light. 12 seeds in the soil, 12 new chances to grow something better than what had been. The land at last was free. The fire crackled low in the hearth, casting golden light across the worn floorboards and onto the faces of the children huddled in a half circle at Bram's feet. Snow fell gently outside, brushing the cabin windows with white lace. The wind howled down the mountain like a distant lullaby, but inside it was warm, filled with the scent of pine, dried lavender, and something sweet baking in the oven. Bram sat in his old chair, the one with the carved arms and the faded blanket draped over the back. His beard was white now, his hands slower, more careful, but his eyes still carried the same depth, rivers that had seen flood and drought alike. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and looked at the wide-eyed children in front of him. Some his kin by blood, others by bond, all of them his in the ways that mattered. "You'll give me 12 sons," he said, voice raspy with age, eyes twinkling. The children gasped, then burst into giggles. "You said that?" one of the girls asked, her pigtail swinging. Bram nodded solemnly. "I did. Stood there like a fool, 7 feet tall, covered in bear hide, thinking I could scare the world into giving me what I lost." "What did she say?" a boy asked, eyes round. Bram leaned back, smiled slowly. "She didn't say a word, not then. Just stared at me like she already knew I'd be the one who'd end up changed." Lian's voice came from behind them, gentle and clear. She was seated by the table beneath the window, the old journal in her lap. Her hands had aged, but her eyes, those deep, thoughtful eyes, had only grown brighter. She turned a page, the ink faded but still legible, the script both Chinese and English. "She wrote it here," Lian said softly. "Every chapter, every season, even the days he refused to talk." "I didn't refuse," Bram grunted. "I was contemplating." "Silently," she said with a smile. The children laughed again. The cabin had grown with them over the years. New beams, painted shutters, shelves lined with hand-labeled jars of herbs. Sketches covered the walls, birds in flight, children playing, a mountain caught in sunset. Light danced on every surface, even on the floor where the dog now snored, curled in front of the fire. Above the door, carved into a smooth piece of cedar and hung with twine, was a wooden plaque. It read, in both languages, "Safe." Bram reached down, picked up a small carving from the table beside him, a crane, wings stretched wide. He passed it to one of the children. "This was hers," he said. "She gave it to me when she chose to stay. Not because she had to, not because I earned it, but because she saw something worth planting." The boy turned the carving in his hands like a treasure. "And now," Bram continued, "every time I hear you laughing in this cabin, every time you run through the garden or draw on the porch railings or ask me about bears, I remember she did raise 12 after all." "Sunflowers don't count," a girl whispered. Bram chuckled. "Shows what you know." Lian closed the journal, her hand resting on the cover. The fire popped, the snow fell, and the old cabin, once a refuge of sorrow, stood as a place of peace. Not perfect, but full. Full of stories, full of healing, full of new roots in old soil. The children began to nod off, one by one, heads resting on shoulders, hands still clutching little pieces of a tale they'd carry long after the night faded. Outside, the valley lay quiet beneath its blanket of snow, but it no longer felt asleep. It felt alive, held, healed. The story lived on.